I was off Holloway's Reach 11 days before the wave came. Routine rotation, nothing more. A systems certification at the orbital yard that any of the senior techs could have done in their sleep. I remember being annoyed about it. I remember the duty roster clerk apologizing for the timing, because my sister was due to visit the coast that month, and I told her it didn't matter. 11 days was nothing. I'd be back before anyone noticed I was gone. The Tarnvek array sat 40 kilometers off our southern shelf, a joint installation under the littoral accord, their listening hardware, our colony, both flags on the housing. It had been there longer than I'd been alive. The treaty was simple on paper. Anything the array heard moving in the seabed got relayed to our colonial authority inside 6 hours, no exceptions, because a fracture event on that shelf could put a wave on our coast inside a day. The Tarnvek had agreed to that window in writing, in their own hand, on their own seal. What I learned later, what the recordings later confirmed past any argument, was that the array heard the fracture building 4 days before it let go. 4 days. The signal sat in a Tarnvek queue marked for review, because relaying it would have tripped a separate clause, a mutual defense escalation cost, expensive, politically awkward, the kind of thing that gets quietly reclassified by someone who decides the number of people on the other end of the warning isn't worth the paperwork. They reclassified it. They called it routine seismic noise, filed it as monitoring advisory 9 Sorrel, non-actionable. They did not relay it. The wave came on its own 4 days later, on a morning the weather reports called clear, and it put 11 meters of water across the lower shelf in under 6 minutes. 41,200 people lived on Holloway's Reach. 40,900 of them did not get off that shelf. My sister was one. I won't dress that up or carry it through the rest of this like a wound I'm reopening on cue. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel something for me. I'm telling you because it's the reason I was standing on the bridge of the farthest tide 11 months later, and because the number matters more than my grief does. What I want you to understand is that the response didn't come from rage. It came from something that had already been sitting cold and ready for a long time, for reasons that had nothing to do with me. Earth's colonial office had never trusted the Littoral Accord, not since it was signed, decades before I was born. The arrangement put a foreign power in sole control of the only early warning hardware on a shelf full of our people, and somebody in that office, I never learned who, and it doesn't matter, had argued from the start that a one-way monitoring agreement is just a slow-motion liability with a treaty seal on it. They lost that argument in committee, but they didn't let it go. For 11 years before the wave, the farthest tide sat at readiness, in a holding pattern past the heliopause. 490 hulls, crewed in rotation, drilled against exactly this scenario, and a dozen others like it, funded out of a line item nobody outside the office ever had to explain. Crews rotated through 6-month postings out there, with nothing to show for the deployment, but drills and maintenance logs, and the slow grind of waiting for a contingency most of them assumed would never come due. Officers who served there told me afterward that the readiness reviews ran every single quarter without fail, the same breach scenarios rehearsed, until the responses were reflex rather than procedure, because the office that funded the line item had decided long before any of us were born that the day it mattered, there would be no time left to improvise. It existed because someone refused to assume good faith from a partner who held the only set of ears on a fault line. When the wave came, the fleet didn't need to be built, it needed to be told. I transferred onto her 3 months after Holloway's Reach went under. Not as compensation, not as a favor, but because my certification was current, and the bridge needed a systems officer who'd run shelf monitoring telemetry before. I didn't ask for the posting. I didn't need to. The work was the work. We didn't move for war the way you'd picture it. There was no declaration shouted across a chamber, no fleet surging out in fury. The Colonial Office filed the Littoral Accord's own breach clause, the Tarnvek's own language, the one they'd written to bind us, used now to bind them, and the farthest tide came out of holding on a transit window that had been calculated months in advance. 490 hulls dropped out of dark transit in formation over the Tarnvek home system on a bright morning, their sun catching every hull at once, and the first thing the fleet did was not fire. The first thing the fleet did was put me, and 6 other officers who'd lost people on that shelf, into a shuttle bound for the Tarnvek's own council chamber. I stood in that chamber under their own daylight, glass overhead, their delegation seated around a table built from some pale local stone, and I read the timeline back to them in full, the fracture signal, the 4 days, the reclassification, monitoring advisory 9 Sorrel, the 6-hour window they had agreed to in writing and never kept. I read all 40,900 names. It took most of the morning. Nobody in that chamber interrupted me. A few of them wept, in whatever way their physiology allows for it, and I want to be honest, that it didn't move me the way I once thought it might. Their grief wasn't the point. The treaty was the point. They had broken something specific and provable, and the proof was sitting in their own archive the whole time, filed under their own classification number, in their own hand. When I finished, the senior delegate asked what Earth required. What Earth required was already underway. Across every Tarnvek holding, 11 listening installations, the orbital relay constellation, the deep array hardware on 3 other shelves where they'd signed the same kind of one-way accord with other species, the Farthest tide's support elements went installation by installation, in daylight, openly, and dismantled the hardware down to the hull plate, not the cities, not the population, not the chamber I was standing in, only the ears. Every piece of equipment the Tarnvek had ever used to listen for a warning, for anyone, theirs or otherwise, was pulled down and crated and lifted into the Farthest tide's holds, installation by installation, while their own engineers stood by and watched it happen, because there was nothing in the breach clause that let them stop it. I went down with the crew that took the deep array on their southern coast, the closest thing they had to a counterpart of the one off Halloway's reach. It looked almost the same housing design, the same redundant relay stacks, the same queue logic that had let a 4-day-old signal sit unread. Our engineers documented every component before they pulled it, not out of mercy but out of precision, so that no one could later claim we'd taken more than the listening itself. It took 6 days across all 11 sites. We didn't raise a single structure that wasn't built for listening. That was the whole of it, and that was deliberate. The disproportion wasn't violence, it was permanence. A power that decided a warning wasn't worth the cost of delivering it lost, forever, every means of ever hearing one again, for themselves, or for anyone foolish enough to sign a one-way accord with them in the future. They will spend the next generation rebuilding what little of that capability the rest of the galaxy lets them rebuild, under terms that will never again put a single shelf of lives behind a queue someone else controls. I read the delegate the same line on the way out of that chamber that I'd read at the start, because it was the only thing left worth saying. 4 days, I told him. You had 4 days, and a treaty in your own hand, and you decided the warning wasn't worth the cost of sending it. We decided your hearing wasn't worth the trust of keeping it. I think about the array sometimes, the original one, 40 kilometers off the shelf I grew up on, sitting wherever it is now, recovered, I'm told, and quiet. I think about the 6 minutes the wave took to cross that shelf, and the 4 days it sat in a queue before anyone let it move. I don't carry the rest of it as a story I tell for sympathy. I carry it as the reason I check every signal twice, why I never let a flagged report sit past the hour it's due, and why I have never once, in all the years since, assumed that silence on a monitoring line means there's nothing out there to hear. There was always something out there to hear. The only question was ever whether someone would tell you in time.